He didn't say it directly, that's what made it explode. Nothing was confirmed, nothing was denied, and that's why this story detonated. The intention of airing this was never there. No one should have ever stated it out or mocked about it. Nevertheless, the atmosphere in the room changed in that split second when Tucker Carlson sat back, took a deep breath, and thoughtfully selected his next remark. Immediately, viewers sensed that something had slipped away. A trail, not a digital record or paper trail, was what it was. A suggestion so ephemeral that it ignited speculation on the internet in an instant. Tucker seemed to imply that federal officials deleted anything that was directly or indirectly associated with Charlie Kirk, according to reports that are currently circulating on social media. Just wait for what came next if you think that sounds crazy. Many began to question whether or not Turning Point USA was involved in the aftermath in any way. Very few words were handpicked, no data were shared, and no remarks were made. The abrupt silence and lengthy gaps gave the impression that something had snapped. Immediate feedback was received. Mini videos became viral. We played back every single pause. Fragment by frame, every word that Tucker uttered or didn't say was dissected. Repetition of the same sentence caused a fire to break out in the comment sections. He must know something, or he wouldn't say that. Those in favor argue that the whole thing is being exaggerated because of how an imprecise comment is being transformed into an extreme thesis. Those who disagree with the idea argue that it is sufficient on its own to call for explanation. A subsequent event was much more disturbing. Nobody was in a rush to turn it off. There was no hasty justification, no vehement rejection, and no critical remediation. People start to freak out when federal authorities remain silent about claims involving evidence and authority. If you stay here, you will not feel like you are participating in random internet talk. After you hear what was purportedly hinted at, how TPUSA even got drawn into it, and why this rumor will not fade away, someone would want to leave the narrative incomplete, and that's how it will feel. The background is important for understanding the rapid explosion of this. It came at a time when confidence in institutions, the media, and official accounts was already on the verge of completely disintegrating. There was a premeditation to this. For months, viewers have been led to think that important material is either concealed, delayed, or discreetly removed before it reaches the public. Whatever the case may be, that way of thinking has permeated society. Therefore, many did not wait for confirmation when someone with Tucker Carlson's influence and background seemed to imply, rather than prove or declare that material connected to Charlie Kirk could have been destroyed by government hands. They crouched down. The context is critical since Tucker has based his approach on inference rather than evidence. He seldom just says, "Here is the file," while holding out a paper. Then he starts asking questions. His scenes are set. He omits details. When there are voids in coverage, they are filled immediately in today's media landscape. A thread of conversation was not the center of attention. What came next was complete quiet. According to viewers, it was subtle, yet noticeable. A shift in delivery, a deliberate selection of wording, and a remark that is left open enough to avoid a direct accusation, while still being heavy enough to encourage interpretation, are all examples of this. Everything begins to spin when it comes to interpretation. Posts on many social media sites started rephrasing their interpretations of his signal within minutes. Real transcripts were replaced with captions. Opinions were piled on top of opinions in response videos. The question of whether or not he had dropped a clue moved to the question of why nobody had stopped this from happening very soon. At that point, Charlie Kirk became an inescapable presence. Reason being, proximity rather than new evidence. Because of his prominent profile and leadership role, Charlie is frequently the object of criticism. People tend to take rumors about government actions and deleted documents very seriously, leading them to believe that something major is going on. Then the fire was fueled by another ingredient. The discussion even included TPUSA, the organization, by relying on online speculation rather than official announcements or documents. The question of whether or not a group that is so strongly associated with Charlie's public identity could even be tangentially involved in whatever it was that Tucker was referring to was brought up by commentators. No charges were leveled, but inquiries. On the other hand, inquiries generate motion. Asking why a group would ever be mentioned is meaningless. The reason why individuals were making connections where none existed was mind-boggling. When the term TPUSA came out, the story went viral even more quickly. The weather plays a role. There was a general consensus that strong actors seldom leave a clean trail, and prior disagreements, current investigations in other fields, and this new development further eroded confidence. As a fuel, uncertainty is present in that context. Remember that no confirmed information has been made public at this time. Nothing in the way of paperwork, filings, or named insiders can be found. However, the story has continued to progress despite the absence of evidence. Modern internet culture interprets a lack of confirmation as an attempt at concealment. This, according to Tucker's defenders, is the classic example of how urban legends spread. Simply by being repeated, a casual comment can develop into a well-developed thesis. Viewers are assigning meaning to something that was never there, they say, and no valid claim was ever made. In response, Tucker's detractors point out that his words carry enormous weight and accountability, and that he is fully aware of their significance whenever he speaks. People on both sides are ignoring each other. What followed is a point of contention for both camps. As soon as the story started circulating, everyone started going over everything in reverse. Previously aired shows were restored, there was a reinterpretation of old conflicts, federal authorities and media outlets that have previously been at odds were once again brought into the spotlight. In this way, setting becomes plot. This was about more than just the suggestions, which adds another layer of complexity. Silence was also a factor. A terse justification never materialized. Quick resistance did not materialize. The reversal did not occur on the screen. Furthermore, silence has a significant impact on how people perceive a tale, even when it does not prove anything. The weight of allegations that may necessitate the removal of evidence is significant. It would be better if it were clarified. Then why not just stop it right now? So why should we let the theory to continue expanding? Reacting, according to some, would do nothing more than fuel an unfounded rumor. Silence, according to some, indicates legal restriction. Another camp maintains that the evasion of blame was intentional and meant to pique interest. Because communications encourage individuals to look between the lines, and because that last concept transforms the moment into a message, it is the most perilous. Experts in the media began to dissect the implications of this behind the scenes, scrambling through options rather than articulating facts. Does the federal government even have jurisdiction over any evidence? Please tell me the regulations regarding the destruction of documents. Such a move would be so out of the ordinary. More questions arose with each inquiry, and the rumor grew more specific with each successive layer. Charlie Kirk's backers fiercely resisted. Rumor has it that the whole story is based on assumptions rather than hard evidence. However, they cautioned that incorporating actual identities and genuine groups into stories that have not been shown to be true is risky and harmful. Some have argued that low levels of public trust are the only conditions under which such speculation may flourish. This mistrust develops when information is hazy and processes appear locked off, even if no one is intentionally trying to hurt anybody. The chasm became wider. Everything changed after that epiphany. Verification was not the point. At issue was trustworthiness. When ideas clash, whose word do you believe? To whom it is due their confidence? The question is, who bears the burden when doubt looms? The significance of this background information is due to that reason. Simply said, documents do not dictate the subsequent events. The reaction of institutions, people, and spectators determines how the rumor will be dealt with when it persists. Plus, it remained vivid. Reason being, not based on what was shown, but on what was implied. When others began to assert they had inside information of camera responses and private consequences that reportedly followed Tucker's statements, the situation went from being a media maelstrom to something far more explosive. At that point, the story began to collapse inward rather than float. Despite Tucker's statements, the article did not go boom. It later erupted. Word on the street is that as soon as the show concluded, phones began ringing non-stop. People who were linked to the media began muttering within hours of the program broadcasting that what took on behind the scenes did not appear at all like the laid-back front that was projected on film. Manufacturers hurried about. Not to bask in its glory, but to decipher its recent release. Editors rewound the footage many times. Here's where the actual conflict started. A number of unnamed internet commenters began to suggest that Tucker's lack of reaction was damage control rather than apathy. Ignoring the proposal would allow it to fester into a major story, while speaking up would make it a headline. Regardless of its merit, that concept gained traction quickly. In a short amount of time, Charlie's name went from being tangentially connected to becoming the focal point of attention. Because the pressure continued to rise rather than because anything new came out. Charlie's close friends and family members were taken aback by the rapid growth of the rumor, which was based on challenged assertions that were being disseminated online. Words like destroyed evidence and federal involvement began to trend with his name within a few hours. Critics believed it was inevitable, while proponents argued it was irresponsible, even in the absence of evidence. Another accusation surfaced later that night, further complicating matters. It was secretly communicated to members of Tucker's team that they were being asked to exercise caution over the manner in which the video was being disseminated. Just so you can grasp how far the interpretation went, not to apologize or bring it back. Because it suggested that the reaction was more than simply online discussion, but rather something that raised concern about who may be affected next. That particular element, regardless of whether it was genuine or not, transformed the tone. Next was the initial significant detour. Even before Tucker brought it up, another media figure asserted, again without evidence, that the phrase destroyed evidence had been circulating in private. It was already going about in some circles, so viewers didn't come up with it, they just repeated it. In the event that this were true, it would imply that Tucker did not initiate the rumor. Rather, he reinforced it. The proposal shook up the conversation since spreading a rumor too far has its own consequences. Out of nowhere, the validity of the allegation became irrelevant to the dispute. It was about the reasons why the rumor got started in the first place, who started it, who spread it, and why it got to the public at the time that it did. After then, TPUSA started to get more attention. Fear of exposure rather than official statements is the driving force. Fans of Charlie Kirk's theories on the internet began to wonder whether, in principle, any organization associated with Kirk could be impacted by accusations connected to government evidence. Multiple levels of what-ifs remained in place of evidence. Still, it's almost hard to get an organization out of a gossip loop once it's started. Commentators were accused by TPUSA supporters of leading a group into unfounded conjecture, prompting strong resistance from the group. Without proof, they said, such stories might cause harm in the real world. Those who are critical pointed out that even potential consequences involving government action cannot shield organizations linked to influential people from investigation. The chasm deepened. Then a different, less dramatic, but nevertheless unsettling development emerged. The audience took note that Tucker dropped the subject entirely in subsequent appearances. The conversation ended there, with no more clarification or follow-up. Continually, he continued on as if nothing had happened. Those who backed it demonstrated that it was unsupported. Those who were critical of the suggestion took this as a sign that it was unnecessary to repeat itself. The new battlefield was that gulf in understanding. The gossip became thicker over the course of the days rather than louder. Detailed explanations and fewer exaggerated posts. In order for such an allegation to be plausible, people started detailing the circumstances that would need to take place. System for overseeing the processing of evidence under federal standards. Since there was only one way to get at the truth, the more it was dissected, the more confused it got. It would be massive if proof had actually been erased. If it hadn't, then the whole enterprise hinged on that one assumption. The entire battle was determined by that tension. People who were rooting for Charlie's narrative to spread were held accountable by his fans. As far as they were concerned, just suggestion was damaging reputations. Claiming to have turned ambiguity into a weapon, they charged Tucker's detractors. Strong voices cannot drop hints and then vanish unnoticed, and Tucker himself planted the seeds of doubt, according to Tucker's detractors. The truth was supposedly being protected by both camps. However, the frame was once again altered by a post one night. A lengthy thread describing how misunderstandings about government processes frequently give rise to conspiracy theories was posted by an unidentified former federal contractor. Misunderstood concepts like destroyed evidence and ordinary processes become dramatic when politics gets involved were mentioned in the conversation. Not only did the message go viral, but it added a new layer of complexity to the rumor, something no one had anticipated. No one lied, but everyone assumed, and now everyone had to confront the possibility that the whole storm could have been constructed on misunderstandings, distrust, and innuendo. It did it again, divided the audience. It served as a reality check for some. Some people thought it was distracting. Tucker Carlson remained silent throughout. Despite the growing uproar around his statements, he made no effort to clarify or reaffirm them. After the evidence was disregarded, the silence became the central point of the argument. Responsibility was the deciding factor. The responsibility of a media voice becomes apparent when even a small indication might trigger such a dramatic storyline. Before putting up a claim, what responsibility does the audience have to attempt to find evidence? When unsubstantiated claims endanger actual reputations, what responsibility do institutions have to intervene? There were no simple solutions to any of the questions. Not a leak or a file was the first big change, and that is why this time is so dangerous. When you realized that you weren't in charge anymore, that was it. Not a single one of the spectators, not even Tucker or Charlie from TPUSA. The storyline was no longer contained. And when a tale gets to that point, it starts to veer off the road. It cascades into unanticipated reactions, camps, and consequences, which is precisely what transpired next. There was no other video that caused the escalation. Caused by deeds. There were noticeable, out-of-the-ordinary shifts in behavior within 2 days after the pivotal portion. The plans were changed. Subtly, things changed. Conversations that would have previously taken place in public now take place in private. When taken as a whole, these actions provided a clear picture, although none of them were particularly noteworthy enough to generate headlines. A collision had occurred. At the first indication, the media took note. Normally outspoken commentators backed off on their usual controversial topics. Carefully avoiding the subject, they refrained from spreading the rumor. Many choose to remain anonymous. Some people seem to be speaking from a rehearsed list whenever they talked. Being cautious was not an accident. Risk management was the focus. Due to the fact that there is no room for error, when a rumor emerges from the noise of the internet and becomes concerns about the actions of the federal government. Next followed the understated reaction from the institutions. Legal and compliance departments across several media sites reportedly took note of the unverified rumors. Even the idea might bring responsibility, so it wasn't that they believed the accusations. The recommendations that were made were simple. Never do that again. Leave it unconfirmed. Keep it down from now on. The objective was to avoid direct confrontation. At that moment, an unexpected change occurred. In other words, not by written wording, but rather by shifting perspectives. An experienced investigative journalist who preferred to remain anonymous made a post elaborating on how misunderstandings over protocols are a common source of tales involving missing or destroyed evidence. No amount of archiving, transferring, replacing, or otherwise rendering records useless can match the internet's imagined catastrophic oblivion. Though it did alter perceptions of the tale, that message did nothing to clear anyone. The question now is not if it occurred, but rather what happened and why, according to many persons. Both sides were upset by the shift. Tucker Carlson's supporters stated that this provided further evidence in support of their stance. That someone took a hint and took it as an allegation, and the story spread because when specifics are lacking, people infer malicious intent. A suggestion from such a massive platform is never harmless, critics said. The use of careful terminology might serve as a shield, but it does not absolve one of responsibility for their actions. Then the detail that turned everything on its head made its appearance. Reiterating without proof, an analyst versed in government oversight systems asserted that extensive paperwork was necessary to erase evidence. Instead of covert deletions or approvals, there should be many levels of oversight and documentation. If that's the case, the whole thing becomes different. If this account is based on assumptions rather than actual events, then either nothing happened, or the events could never have been hidden. The myth persisted despite the fact that both choices mitigate the initial concern. Why? Reason being, the plot had strayed from the facts. It came down to the individuals that people choose to put their faith in. When systems seem inaccessible, who can users put their faith in? Everyone loses when doubts remain. Who loses out when evidence lags behind suggestions? Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA were thrust into that very setting, carrying the burden of connection rather than being charged. Being associated with a narrative that won't go away causes tension, even in the absence of concrete allegations. There was rumor that has not been confirmed that there was covert pressure to diffuse the situation without becoming involved. Engaging would provide credibility to the story, not because anything secret was hiding. It only takes a remark to become front-page news. It just takes a denial for an image to go viral. More inquiries could follow an explanation. Keeping silent was supposedly the plan. However, there is a cost to being silent. A new plot point emerged as time went on, alleging that the lost evidence was really secondary to the power of insinuation to weaponize distrust. A change in emphasis from federal behavior to media ethics occurred among commentators, focusing on how viewers make sense of clues rather than on established organizations. We expected the temperature to drop after making that adjustment. It really made both sides harder. Some felt this was an attempt to shift blame away from the initial suggestion by shifting the focus. It was the only way to reverse a narrative that had gone out of hand, according to supporters. Then something else came to light. The identity of the former network standards editor has not been verified, but they stated that there are frequent and dreaded discussions inside the company on suggested accusations. Networks are more concerned with suggestive framing, which poses legal and reputational risk without proving anything, than with plain lies, according to one assessment. If that's true, it changes the meaning of the first event, for the purpose of testing boundaries, rather than leaking or alerting others. The question is whether the phrase was intentionally vague, or meant to gauge how far a proposal may go before being redirected. If it was a test, then the answer was not a fluke. It was data, and that thought stoked the fires of controversy. Information on institutional reflexes with regard to audience trust and the rate of story dissemination in the absence of intervention. Simultaneously, onlookers detected a further anomaly. The storyline ceased to evolve. Nothing new came out of it. There were simply restatements of already covered material. When there is no improvement, it is a signal. Because walls demand decisions, this signifies that the plot has hit a wall. The stakes are higher if you speak up. Do not speak till it has solidified. You risk being accused of avoiding if you redirect it. Each route had its own price. Finally, at that point, word started to go around among media experts about one last viewpoint. That brittle trust, rather than a lack of proof, was the true weakness in this situation. The moment clues are taken for granted. Since the most detrimental outcome would be a precedent rather than a file, that concept struck a chord. As an example, if suggestion alone can hurt someone's image, it will attract organizations and make everyone quiet. Not because the truth requires it, but because of the risk. A terrifying idea sprang from it. Future tales will not require facts to erupt if suggestions can wreak as much damage without verification. All they'll need is a pause and a timing tone. Things had calmed down considerably by the weekend's end. Nothing was clarified. Nobody saw the subsequent episodes. No papers were found. There was less movement in the plot, but it was still there. Once a story delves into doubt, it stays there indefinitely, which is the most perilous consequence. At each subsequent test of trust, it serves as a reminder, a caution, and a shadow. This propelled the narrative into the next phase, where audiences and media institutions' reactions began to focus on what had changed, rather than just this particular event. A shift from shock to strategy had taken place by that point in time. There has been a noticeable quiet on the internet. The experience consisted of observing the division of opinion into camps that hardly spoke with one another, each of which was certain that the other side was lacking everything. There has never been any particular accusation, according to Tucker Carlson's supporters. That a culture that is always looking for an excuse to get angry blew a suggestion out of proportion. Viewers are equally responsible for their interpretations of ambiguity, they said, and asking questions, even sharp ones, is not the same as making assertions. It was interpreted differently by critics. There is no such thing as a harmless suggestion coming from a platform of that magnitude. Because it avoids responsibility, while yet sowing uncertainty, that suggestion without explanation can be much more damaging than an incorrect statement. Power, not proof, was their concern. Who gets to provide a hint and go, and who has to face the repercussions? That schism became solid very fast. At the same time, Charlie Kirk felt a heavier, quieter vibe in his immediate vicinity. In their condemnation of what they referred to as innuendo warfare, his followers stood in unison and emphasized the lack of evidence. They expressed concern that reports based only on inference were ensnaring actual reputations. They did not change their stance. Present the proof if it exists. Not only does silence not reset a story, but it also freezes it, according to critics. According to them, if you don't deal with even partial explanations, conjecture will take over. From their point of view, ambiguity was changing people's perceptions of everything, not safeguarding anybody. However, the industry itself saw the most illuminating shift. The matter became a live wire in the eyes of the editors, producers, and legal teams. Very much not allowed, but stayed away from. Without restating the central point, commentary displays relevant web buzz. Without mentioning any names, the panels discussed media implication and accountability. No ambiguity was intended. The topic of conversation was obvious to everybody. That restraint spoke a lot without saying much more. Without any other information, it proved that the threat was substantial. The risk of slander, of things getting out of hand, of saying anything that may be interpreted as an allegation. Institutions do not engage in truth-seeking arguments when faced with such a danger. Risk management is their specialty. Individuals spoke of a peaceful resetting behind closed doors. Cautionary notes were sent out using provocative language. It was instructed that producers keep assertions and inquiries distinct. It was emphasized that hosts should not utilize pauses or language that may be interpreted as implying anything. Its irony was plain to see. We were now viewing the pauses, hints, and deliberate ambiguity that had started the fire as potential dangers. The weight of being close by without being accused was felt by Turning Point USA as this reset played out. No comments have been made, refutations rejected. Still, results for searches involving the group started to appear, a trend that is well known to media experts. Narrative gravity is achieved by proximity. Unfair guilt by proximity was the term used by supporters. It was inevitable, according to critics, when stories dealt with institutions and leadership simultaneously. In any case, the effect was tangible. The focus was on how things looked. Terminology was refined. Space was covertly established to serve as a buffer zone rather than a verdict. Much of the public discourse proceeded in the same manner. From "did this happen" to "what does this reveal about how stories spread," the focus changed. Some people think that implication is a dangerous shortcut for journalists, while others think it's a good tool. Some have argued that it encourages critical thinking. Some people think it promotes paranoia. Stress from anger based on doubt was a major concern, according to mental health advocates. Even when asked as questions, repeating proposals without proof might be dangerous, as legal experts warned viewers. Clarity is not only about telling the truth, it's also about limiting harm, according to media ethicists. This was not a collection of extreme views. They were mainstream, composed, and gaining clout. Not because it was proven false, but because it was recast. The initial rumors started to go off as they became louder. Now we're looking at how implication affects trust rather than missing evidence. That change made everyone nervous. Proponents thought it legitimized excessive action. Powerful voices would be forgiven, according to critics. Satisfaction was lacking. Fatigue set in afterwards. Theoretical debates eventually become old news. Subjects that were deemed safer were chosen by the creators. The threading rate decreased. The narrative persisted. It became solid. People began to speak cautiously and with raised eyebrows whenever it was brought up. That solidification poses a threat. Nothing is required to prove or disprove it. It blends with the scenery. Analysts of the market have noticed this trend. There is no conclusion to stories that don't finish. What follows is colored by the reputational sediment that they sink into, revealing significance with each pause. There is weight in every pause. Each hint goes on longer than it ought to. At that point, the long-term impacts became evident. New standards emerged in the media. The hosts either grew more forthright or more careful. Meetings were held to discuss the hints. It became increasingly usual to provide clarifications. Institutions responded by enforcing stricter regulations when the cost of ambiguity became apparent. The past cannot be changed by new regulations. The lesson for Tucker's backers was that spectators shouldn't infer too much from a lack of noise. His detractors learned the hard way that strong platforms' ambiguity needs immediate attention. Silence invites projection, according to Charlie's supporters. The lesson was direct for organizations such as TPUSA. It is possible for association to be costly. A single reality became apparent once the dust had settled. I didn't see any files. All assertions were refuted. No charges were proven. The situation, however, had changed. Already delicate trust had been further strained by the idea. It became clear that media influence is both potent and prone to fluctuations. One thing that viewers saw was how slowly a narrative may cool down after being hot without proof. We were all left gazing at the same core that hadn't been resolved. This is what occurs when suggestions spread more quickly than evidence can be verified, not because the government threw out proof. You already know that this was never about a single phrase or pause if you stuck with it. Because of the presence of ambiguity in the room, it was about power and responsibility, as well as how quickly a tale can go out of hand. It is now up to you. Leave a comment with your honest opinion. The internet may have misunderstood what Tucker Carlson meant when he made a veiled reference to a matter of such grave importance without providing any evidence to support his claims. The speaker or the listener is not held responsible when influential people make suggestions rather than accusations. In light of the careless media cycle, would it have been wise for Charlie Kirk or TPUSA to speak out or remain silent? The impending separation of this area makes it crucial. Everyone thinks they are defending the truth. The opposite side is being blamed by everyone. We need to know your position. Keep your wits about you, because this is far from over. Narratives are shaped by instances such as this, according to media insiders. Both the permissible and obligatory forms of expression are rethought by them. People will keep this in mind the next time a prominent individual takes a break from the camera. Like this video to help others understand the concept of implication and stay ahead of the curve. The next story could be even bigger and messier, so subscribe now. Set up notifications so you won't miss a beat when doubt becomes responsibility. The fallout has already begun, regardless of whether this was a warning, an error, or a strategic move. Post your opinion down below. Decide now or never. Give an account of the reasons. Be prepared.